Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Biljana Nikolova, and I'm the Customer Executive of Government, Education and Community. And I have the pleasure of co-hosting today's webinar with Shamal Das, the Head of Philanthropic Services of JB Weir. So thank you for joining us on this webinar. So tuning in today, we have our government, education and community customers and JB Weir customers from all around Australia. So it's interesting times, right? It's one of those things that probably even just 4 months ago, if someone told us that we would be facing into a COVID-19 pandemic and that we would have been asked to rearrange and adjust our personal and professional lives in the way we have, we would have probably thought that, it was all massive nonsense and, they were completely ridiculous. However, here we are, we're facing into unprecedented events. We're seeing businesses being shut down, lots of people losing their jobs. Those of us who are still employed, we're mainly working from home. Our kids are mainly homeschooled. We see quite a few of our elderly being isolated. We're probably, most of us, constricted in the way we can travel and where we can travel. So it is indeed very unusual. To bring it closer to the industries that we cover or the participants of those industries in this webinar today, local councils are starting to extend rate payment terms for their landlords as they're starting to face into challenges with collection of rates landlords are starting to face challenges with collection of rent. Schools had to very quickly transition to online delivery of schooling programs. Childcare centers were asked to remain open and provide care services for free for parents that are in essential jobs. And we've seen quite a few our for-purpose customers having to cancel their fundraising events, which has been quite devastating for quite a few. So this is a true black swan event, we've got, I guess, this concept introduced to us in 2007 by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It is an extremely rare event, right, with severe impacts. And what makes this circumstances extremely challenging is that we don't really know when they're going to end, right? And we don't really know that when they end, if life will look any similar, or I guess, the normal will be any similar to the normal we were used to before COVID-19. So with all of this in mind, many business owners, many organizations, many individuals are facing difficult decisions, and they're seeking guidance, they're seeking support, reassurance in making these decisions. And to that end, today we have Alan Oster, our NAB Chief Economist, with us to share NAB's view on the economy. Alan will discuss the macroeconomic situation and how the banks and government stimulus is playing out to support the economy, and he will also share his early thoughts on what our economic recovery may look like. We also have Daniel Farrell from our markets team here with us today, and Daniel will take us through what's happening in markets, and he will also provide some intelligence on the current interest rate environment. So we will also provide you with an opportunity to ask questions after Alan's and Daniel's update. So before we move on to the fun part of the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping points. So we have 60 minutes allocated for this webinar today. We will have 20 minutes at the end dedicated to questions. Some people have already asked their questions through the RSVP, which has been fantastic, and we will seek to address those first. And for any further questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom. It's either at the bottom or the top of the screen. And also make sure that you put your name in front of the question so we can call you out when answering the question. So without any further ado, over to NAB's esteemed Chief Economist, Alan Oster.
Thank you very much. As you were saying, these are unprecedented times, really. If I'll start off and talk a little bit about the globe and then come back down in terms of what we're seeing locally. It really depends on when the economy started to close down. So if you're looking at China, that was sort of January, February. They published their GDP numbers last week, and that was essentially 9.8% fall in the quarter. So this means essentially that China this year is probably going to record very small growth, having been growing at 6% or thereabouts, and expectations were they were going to continue. In terms of the other big developed economies, most of us are being hit in the June quarter, and you're seeing very large numbers there. So the US is going to put some numbers out next week, and they'll probably be down about 1%. But when they come to the second quarter, they're probably going to be down 10%. And also in the US, what you're seeing is very large numbers of people enrolling for the dole. And if you believe those numbers, it sort of says unemployment in the US is already somewhere around 12 to 15%. And then you look across Europe, you look across the UK, you look at Japan, all of them have got these really big hits in the June quarter. Most of them in year average terms. In other words, most of them assume that maybe we're starting to reopen things around September, and then you get some fast bounce backs. But roughly year average, most of them -5, -6. And then you sort of see countries like India that are only growing at about 2%. Everybody's sort of cut their rates as far as they can and are now essentially either QE or buying, trying to control the bonds. But the context is that prior to, or if you like, post the Depression, the Great Depression, the biggest fall in global growth was in the GFC, and that was global growth was flat. In this recession, we're talking about global growth of about -2.8%. So this is a very different recession, but it's very deep and it's scary because no one really knows exactly when it's going to be over. If I then move a little bit to Australia to give you some feel, a lot of the data that we do internally basically saw big collapses in the second half of March. And that's important because it sort of means that a lot of the official data is really very, very delayed and hard to see. So you may have seen the labour market didn't change much in the March numbers. I think it went from 5.1% unemployment to 5.2%. But that was in early March. And then you come into what's happening next. A good example is we ran a business survey for the first quarter, which went basically from mid-February to mid-March. Business conditions, business confidence didn't really change. Then we ran the same survey at the end of March, and business confidence basically went from about -4, in other words, about 4% more pessimist than optimist, to -66. And to put that in context, that's 3 times worse than the bottom of the 1990 recession in Australia, which was our biggest one. Also, what you saw is capacity utilisation. You saw forward orders. Anything that's got a forward-looking view fall to levels that were worse than the bottom of the 1990 recession. Business conditions, which is employment, trading, profits, etc., like that, they fell a lot, record fall, but they didn't quite get to the bottom of the 1990 recessions. But the bad news is it's going to be there very soon. We'll be going back out into the field to have a look. What we're sort of expecting at present is that we would expect to see a very small fall in GDP in the March quarter because it was fine up until mid-March in most sectors, maybe not in airlines and hospitality, but it really crunched from mid-March.
Then in the June quarter, we'll expect growth to fall about 7%. We expect maybe another fall of about 1%. So during the next 3 quarters, we're expecting something like an 8.5% fall in activity. And we don't see that very often. The other thing I think is important to get a bearing on is we expect a big bounce back in growth rate terms. But if you fall at 8% and then recover at 8% from that lower level, you're not back to the level that you started at. And in our forecast, you don't get back to where we were at the end of 2019 until about mid-2022. The other big difference in this sort of scenario is this is very different in terms of its impact vis-a-vis past recessions on the labour market. So normally what happens in a recession is people see things going south, sort of make people work less hours, and then gradually they put them off. So in the 1990 recession that started in the middle of 1990, the peak unemployment rate was December 1992, and it was 11.2%. What we are seeing, you see it in some of the official data that you see in some statisticians starting to do payroll data. And he basically said in the couple of weeks at the end of March to the first week of April, about 5%, 5.5% of the labour market lost their jobs or didn't get paid. So we would expect to see unemployment by the middle of the year somewhere around about 11.75%. The government's talking about 10%. I'll be brutally honest, I can't tell the difference between 10 and 12%, but I can say it's a lot, and it's going to be really nasty. Government spent about 10% of GDP. A lot of it is on JobKeeper, and that will, to my point of view, probably mean that you won't get the 15 or 20% unemployment rates that would otherwise have been possible. But it's a lot of damage has been done. And where we see the situation is that that unemployment rate of 11.5-ish will sort of stay there. It will then improve over the course of the 2021 period, but it will probably still have a 7 in front of it. The RBA is out there talking about similar sort of falls in GDP. They're saying unemployment might get to 10%. They sort of have to say that because that's what the government said. And then they have 6% unemployment at the end of the year after. So it's going to be there for a while. It's going to take a lot of time for people to get their confidence back. I think you're probably going to have a phased reduction in terms of some of the restrictions. To me, well, you've already seen that you can, dentists are open and you can have elective surgery. I think they will slowly open up clubs and pubs, slowly close down the idea that you have state borders that are closed. I think it'll take a really long time before they open up the international. So you do get some sectors like education, tourism, that will be fundamentally changed. There's also some significant impacts normally in things like property prices. Normally, if you get 8% unemployment, that's bad news because that's when people default. The good news to some extent is the banks are operating as something like a shock absorber. They're basically trying to provide essentially facilities where you don't have to pay any interest for 6 months, or if you're in trouble, let us know and we can rearrange things for you. And that has been taken up big time. And I think the banks, to be brutally honest, won't be foreclosing on any viable customer being viable before the virus hit. But I would expect to see, and someone's going to ask me this, so I'll answer it now. I would expect to see house prices fall up to 15% over the next 12 months. I'm more worried about commercial property. If you think about it, we're all doing Zoom and we'll sort of work from home. I'm not sure that that will change permanently. And therefore, there'll be a lot of office space in particular that essentially people don't need as much. And so I think there'll be some big increases in commercial property issues. Education, obviously, migration's going to come down a lot, and foreign students are, going to be a problem. If we look at our internal data, we see big hits in tertiary sector and we see big hits in secondary sector. If you're in a sort of a giving area, consumers, if they can't meet their own household balance sheets and budgets, are not going to give much money away if they possibly can help it. So I've sort of almost done my 15 minutes. So I do think some things will change permanently. I do think the international tourism education system is going to be fundamentally changed. And I think there's some serious hits to commercial property, all of which says that whilst it's a V in growth, it'll take a long time to get back to normal. You don't need to worry much at all about interest rates going up. They won't. I don't worry at all about the government spending a lot of money and increasing our debt levels. To me, if you trade off, a higher debt level, and therefore maybe you lose your AAA against a recession that's less deadly and less deep, that's a good trade. I also think that once you get on the other side, whenever that is, they'll have to basically spend more in terms of fiscal policy. So if you think about it, a lot of their measures are targeted. So JobKeeper, for example, stops in 6 months' time. What happens then? And you'll need to spend more money. You need to get more money into the consumer's hands so that they can spend it and feel happier. I suspect what you're going to see is governments arguing that you shouldn't waste a crisis and then try and do things like reform in areas like taxation, maybe in industrial relations. I think that might be a bit more politically tricky, but they'll be looking for fundamental reforms in the economy as we go forward. So it's a very sobering period. If you wanted to say a couple of positive things, you'd say, I think Australia's done a lot better on the health scheme than we all expected it to. We are not as negative in terms of the GDP numbers we're going to be printing as a lot of Europe and even New Zealand is going to be. Why? Because we didn't close down our economy as much as what some of those economies either voluntarily did, which is New Zealand, or compulsory did, which is sort of Europe, the UK, and to some extent the US. But I do think it's going to be a tricky period for quite a while. And you do need to realise that this is something that we've never seen before. And it's very difficult to understand exactly when everything's going to recover. But it will take time. And I'm nowhere near as optimistic that the Reserve Bank is that says, oh, we might fall by 6%, but then we'll grow by 6%. I just don't think you're going to get that sort of recovery. We have a fall of about 4% this year in year average terms and a rise of around the same next year. So I might stop there, and I'm sure I'll get lots of questions, and then we'll back over to Daniel, do we?
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Helen. That was very insightful. I will ask Daniel Farrell now to provide an overview of what we're seeing in the markets. Over to you, Daniel.
So I'll just unmute myself. Thank you very much, Biljana and Alan. So just to put in context, my name's Dan Farrell. I look after the interest rate risk management business. My job really is to discuss with customers what's going on in financial markets and then assist them with managing their interest rate risks. I cover obviously the government education and community sector in New South Wales, but I also cover the agricultural sector, the corporate health sector, and also the franchise sector. So quite a diverse book, and the advantage of that is getting to speak to a range of different businesses. The customers typically range from large family groups right through to listed corporates with debt loads sort of between the 5 million to 250 million or so. And I guess, as many of you would have seen, we've announced a number of official measures to assist customers through this time, including interest and principal relief for the next 6 months. please speak to your banker directly or your relationship manager directly about these. I guess what I'm going to cover today is to talk through what we're seeing in terms of customer behaviour in managing interest rate risk through this time. NAB's very well positioned to provide this data. We have unprecedented access due to our presence in the small and medium corporate sector and corporate Australia. We bank roughly a third or 30% or so of the sector. We also have the highest relationship strength across any foreign or domestic bank in interest rate and FX markets, according to the industry survey, which is Peter Lee. So we really, we've got lots of customer relationships. We have a very big markets desk. We really see what customers are doing, which provides us a really good snapshot, I guess, of how the business is going. Throughout this time, we've seen customer behaviour really comes down to two factors. It's those that have been affected by COVID-19 and those that have not. And that's really dictating the behaviour of customers at the moment. I guess for those that have been impacted, it really centres around cash flow relief for the next 6 months, perhaps longer. So what we typically see is if a customer has hedging in place at the moment, so they've got fixed rates in place, it's typically at a much higher rate than what's achievable in the current market right now as interest rates have fallen. So what we've been looking to do is to restructure these trades for customers, usually by terminating their existing trade and embedding that cost into a new trade for a longer duration, which produces a lower rate, typically produces a lower rate for the customer over the life of the loan. We're also assisting by restructuring customers where they can actually go from their current fixed rates into variable for a period of time. So they benefit from the incredibly low variable rate that's on offer, I guess, at the moment. And it also frees up cash flow when that may be tighter, given the underlying business conditions. And then they switch back to fixed at some point down the future when they so that they are still protected against any adverse interest rate movements that could be experienced much further down the track. But we don't see anything immediate on the horizon that's a threat there. Obviously, as Alan's already highlighted. We're also in some cases using derivative products to provide customers rates under the variable rate for a period of time, and then seeing them revert back to a fixed at a slightly higher rate than what they would have got without using those products down the track. Again, trying to push out the next 6 months and assist them while cash flow is tighter and while there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, but then also still managing their longer term needs and ensuring that they're covered. And then I guess the other side of customer behaviour is those customers that aren't affected by COVID. I'm seeing a lot of this particularly in the agricultural sector. Multi-generational farms, you see it a lot in the health space, which obviously they're working very, very hard at the moment. So I guess, and Alan's alluded to it, with the RBA, I guess, initially easing monetary policy and then employing yield curve control. So they've been buying up bonds effectively to lower interest rates. This is lowering longer term interest rates where customers tend to borrow. I guess you could say that this is the RBA's version of flattening the curve. They are really trying to lower longer term interest rates to make it easier for corporates to continue to borrow. Because I think if you access to capital and borrowing is what makes the world go around effectively and ensures economic growth. So I think they're really trying to support as much as they can through that. And with those lower rates via monetary policy that we've been seeing, really the customers that haven't been very adversely affected through these recent times are opportunistically looking to hedge really long term. So sort of 5, 7, 10 years, maybe even longer, because their view is that I'm still going to have the core debt very long term. While rates may not be going anywhere for a while, it's certainly not going higher for a while, I can still take really good advantage of where rates are very long term. So I guess that hedging tenor aspect really comes down to customers, if they've got a hedging policy, which a lot of corporates have to, it's their view of markets. Some are saying that the current fiscal work, particularly in some of the monetary policy settings, could lead to some inflation down the track. I'm not seeing that right now, obviously, but it definitely is. It is a risk longer term. It comes down to their risk appetite. It comes down to the banking covenants, and it comes down to the length of the asset that you're that you've borrowed against. It typically is how long you're going to hold that. So, I guess, yeah, the longer term you expect to hold the asset, and the longer term you expect to hold the debt, then it makes sense. But it's certainly not for every customer to go out and look at say a 10-year interest rate swap or something like that. So, yeah, I hope that gives you a bit of an overview, I guess, of what we're seeing over the last, particularly 6 weeks. I know that the desk has been busier in the last 6 weeks than they've ever been. And we've got some sort of market veterans there that have been on the desk over 30 years. So it's been a very unprecedented time, but we're certainly here to help. And I'll hand back to Biliana.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Greatly appreciate it. So we will go now to the Q&A part of the webinar. We did receive quite a few questions from our RSVPs, and we have selected a number of those that we thought were not answered in depth, obviously, through the presentation. So before I jump into the questions, again, just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function on Zoom if you have any live questions or any current questions, and I can see quite a few of those coming through now. So the first question, Alan, is for you, and it's around rates, and it is why are variable rates still so high, over 3%, when the RBA rates are at 0.25%?
Well, I suspect it depends on what product you're using. What the Reserve Bank's essentially trying to do, and Daniel covered this, is essentially set the 3-year bond rate equal to the cash rate. And that sort of adds on additional sort of flattening of the curve in the longer run. In terms of the gaps between the various products and the cash rate, essentially I suspect that's an element of risk and an element both of personal risk, as in what the bank thinks of you as a customer and what industry you're in. So hopefully there's no retailers here today. Discretionary retail is not doing very well and hasn't been doing for 12 months. And so you're going to have a higher premium on that in terms of what's happening. I think one of the issues also out there that someone may ask me is that whilst the government is guaranteeing the banks in relation to providing credit that we can keep lending, and people are taking up that opportunity big time, the government doesn't guarantee you, the customer. The government guarantees the bank. So one of the things we have to make sure is people can actually pay us off over the medium term, or however long the loan is. So whilst it's a holiday in terms of the interest payments in the short term, it's still being capitalised. And so therefore there is a risk. And our CEO used to run RBS, and apparently, according to him, one of the big problems in the UK was that people assumed this loan was guaranteed by the government, therefore they didn't have to pay it back. So, and that caused a lot of grief during the GFC. But, I think ultimately the short answer is this is a combination of, we do not borrow, and the other thing is we don't roll the bank funding on a cash rate. So we have a chunk of our money, about 60, 70% of it is basically beyond the curve. So we want to have what we call stable funding, if I can put it that way. In other words, we could not roll a book of, a couple of 100 or 300 billion on a cash rate. It's got to go further out the curve. And what the RBA is trying to do is flatten that cost, but it is a cost that you still have that you have to try and recover. So it's a combination of risk and also a combination of the actual funding costs. Our total funding cost is not 0.25 because we've got to borrow one offshore, and that's got currency risk. And then secondly, we've got to borrow in the markets as well. Most of the time we like to borrow beyond 3 years to give us time.
Thanks, Alan. The next question is for Daniel. And Dan, I know you touched a bit on some of the hedging strategies that we can put in place to actually, allow customers to take advantage of the low interest rate environment if they happen to have a hedged position, which is obviously hedged at a higher interest rate level. This is probably more around the fixed rate loans. So the question is, the question came obviously from a school, but can schools restructure their fixed loans with lower rates now available without additional expenses incurred, and those expenses being break costs?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, there's been another question, I guess, come through around existing hedging arrangements. So as part of this, so I guess to answer the question, we can restructure the facilities to lower short-term cash flows, but how we're typically doing this is not by, I guess, writing off the economic cost. We are embedding this into a longer-term facility and taking advantage of those longer-term lower rates at the moment. So I guess there is a cost to be borne in terms of terminating existing facilities, certainly. And I guess where we can help you is by not necessarily seeing you make a payment up front, because I don't think that's helping anyone in the current environment with very tight cash flows, particularly if you have been affected by COVID operations. So as I said, there's ways that we can re-embed that into another fixed rate, or that may not necessarily start straight away. It may start in 6 months or 12 months or something like that. That rate would be slightly higher than what would be achievable in the current market because of that embedded cost, but it may be lower than what you're currently paying, with the additional benefit that you're accessing the lower variable rate right now when your business most needs it.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. So now we have a question for Shamal. It's good that we're getting obviously varied, I guess, questions that touch on various parts of our business and various solutions. So Shamal, the question is, are there any indications of what the impact currently looks like on the not-for-profit sector and how the sector is responding? So how is the philanthropic sector responding, obviously, to COVID-19? I know that you and your team have been working quite a lot trying to answer these questions. And there was obviously a paper also being published a couple of days ago. So yeah, it will be great to hear from you, Shamal.
Thank you, Biljana. I guess it's something we concentrate on every day of the year, but it's been a really alarming period for the sector, in a sense of the sector already had sustainability issues in it. When 8% of the organisations have 92% of the income and hold 92% of the assets, you've got a very large sector where the majority is small and medium already, and quite reliant on single sources of income. So what we're seeing is, and we all know that economic crises, and especially the type we're going through at the moment, will affect the lower socioeconomic areas hardest. So the sector is stuck in this really unenviable position where funding models are challenged. At the same time, demand for services, whether they're in homelessness, family violence, mental health, whatever it may be, the demand for services is going up. There are so many people who are already on the edge of poverty, on the edge of homelessness. And this is like a tsunami that has been pushed down a bit further. And I agree with Alan that some of the government initiatives, regardless of ideology, have been very powerful. But how you unwind something like this in an economy like this will be really important, because what we've seen is the initial crisis reaction of survival at an organizational level at the moment. But what we haven't seen is that sort of, now we're only starting to see, I guess, that lifting of the heads a little bit to say, well, strategically, what do we now have to do to actually prosper when the new world emerges? And how do we recover, and how do we actually serve our beneficiaries rather than just making sure we exist in 6 months' time? And an important part of that funding puzzle, and I'll pick up a question by Peter Dexter, who was asking a question around support, the amount of support, and Alan's already made a comment on this, is the paper we released about only yesterday morning, I think, on the impact we estimate on philanthropy, is that where philanthropy would have naturally risen about 5% per annum, as it has in the last 2 years. We expect it to fall 7% this year. And that's even building in the bushfire relief, which is sort of bolstered it a bit because a lot of giving came forward, if you will. But we expect to see about a 12% fall next year. So where it should have been going up at 5% per annum, we see 20% down over that 2-year period, which really puts you back at 2012 levels. So organisations perhaps significantly that rely on philanthropic funding from individuals in the arts, for instance, and in other sectors, they are likely to be helped quite, have significant sustainability concerns as cash flow dries up, and as donors perhaps feel the pinch a lot more. And you can see this really will come through in things like international aid, which relies on mums and dads giving $300, $400 a year. That'll be significant. So we expect to see more, hopefully, collaboration and organisations coming together to create better organisations at the end of this. So hopefully the burning platform doesn't go to waste in that sense. Alan, do you have anything to add to that? Or I had another question coming through from some of the work you've just done. Let me go first to pick up a question from the live chat, is that you mentioned the impact on parts of the property market, but what are your views on retail specifically? You're on mute still, Alan, though. There you are.
There I am. Okay, so retail's doing lots of different things at present. Now, if you think of total consumption as consisting of retail and also non-retail. So non-retail would include education, health, childcare, all that sort of stuff. Up until recent, so what we've been seeing in retail, we use internal data. So I probably should say that we've now got a system where on retail and consumption, we can see everything that goes across our electronic channels, and they're about 5 million a day. I can gather that information on Tuesday based on the week finishing last Sunday. So what we've been seeing is these massive increases in food and supermarkets. Think hoarding. We've also seen some massive increases in things like people buying fridges to stick all the extra food they've got in. We're seeing at present lots of people buying stuff to work from home from. But we're also seeing some sectors being absolutely decimated. So accommodation, clubs, pubs, recreational services, footy, all that sort of thing. If you were doing $100 this time last year, they're doing 10 this year. Same thing, we own essentially high caps. So people, if you don't know what high caps is, if you're not going to the doctor, you're not going to the hospital, you're going to the dentist, the pharmacy, or physio or whatever, the terminal that you swipe your card through is actually owned by NAB. So we own the whole lot. And we're seeing the amount of money going through those terminals are about 10% of what they were 12 months ago. So you get these massive swings. So you may have seen retail trade yesterday went up, but it went up because supermarkets went up 50%. I can tell you in the first couple of weeks of April, supermarkets are no longer going up. And that means when we add up consumption in total, we get these falls of 10 to 15%. And that is 50% of the economy. So in retail, it is really, really tough. And particularly discretionary retail, it's not happening. Why? Because people are trying to put their budgets together. The last thing they're going to do is spend something they don't need. And regrettably, that's also having a bit of a problem in terms of the not-for-profits. So, you know, why would you give somebody money that you need to balance your own budget in the short term? You might want to give it to them, et cetera, and when you get re-established, you will, and that's why you get your 20% fall that you were talking about before. So on retail, we are quite worried.
It also will depend on which part of retail you're in. So if you're in the CBD and you've got a shop that caters for office and the office is now vacant, that's a big issue. And those sort of things, we don't see retail improving at all. So we have for the next 2 quarters falls in consumption 9-10% per quarter.
And what is that? And how does that flow through real retail property then as an investment?
Well, so retail property is going to be awful. I mean, it's going to be office, it's going to be retail. Industrial is probably better. CBDs, hotels ain't great. But, retail in terms of property it's been falling for ages anyway. And now you've got something that's just magnified it by a factor of 10. So it's not good.
So, as you know, we're in the JB Weir part of the NAB family. So we're looking at, and we're trying to figure out this disconnect between what's happening in financial markets and the economic markets. It's quite an interesting, you're walking on both sides of the street at once, really. You could have.
I was going to say, let me give you an example of NAB specific. Okay, so we've 35,000 people working in NAB.
At present, 30,000 of them are working at home. So the question then is obviously going to get asked, do we need 3 or 4 big office towers in Sydney and Melbourne? Now, that's not going to be, it's going to be taken straight away, but you can see where that's going to
go. Look, you, and something obviously we're reading everything that comes out on our side of the business, but you for those on the call who may not have seen it, NAB just put out their views on inflation/deflation in short term. What are your short and long term views on inflation and deflation? And I guess, given the level of debt that you've already mentioned, how does that? What is the impact on growth that you see? As it washes through.
Okay. So the first thing, and it's sort of very simple. So we don't expect to see wages growing at 2.5% anytime soon. So if we just basically put in wages growth as 1% next year or this year,
1.5-ish, that drives essentially inflation next year essentially to 0. Now, there will be some sectors where you get all sorts of impacts. In the June quarter, so you're going to get some really volatile data. So in the short run, petrol prices are down 16% at present relative to where they were in the first quarter. You've also got the impact of the government's childcare stuff, where essentially if it cost you $100 before to put your kids in childcare, under the government scheme, it's now going to cost you $5. So we could see headline inflation falling 2% in the June quarter. But in a fundamental sense, in a core sense, we've got a 0.25 for growth in inflation next year over the course of the year. That has an economy point of view, has quite a negative impact. And the reason for that is if you think of cash rates at 0.25 and inflation currently is 1.5, the real cash rate is -1.25. If inflation drops to 0.25, the real cash rate is now 0. So the real cash rate's gone up 1%, which is negative for growth. So on inflation, I think in the medium term, you're going to find it's going to be really low. If you want to put a spin on that, that means you're not going to see an increase in interest rates for, 2024 maybe. They might, if we're lucky. It's going to be a long, long time, because if the RBA is still targeting 2.5% and they're getting 0.25, they're not doing anything anytime soon. And, I'm not talking about 2021. I'm talking 2 to 3 years beyond that.
So through to 2023 even, washing out.
2024.
So that goes to a question. So what does that actually mean for those parts of the economy where there is still money, in terms of what does that mean for housing in and of itself as an investment? But what about the other housing debt serviceability for those people with this housing, with interest rates that low? And then what does that mean for the bank, I guess?
You have to be careful. Australian private sector debt as a percent of GDP, or should be a percent of their income, is quite high. That's the gross debt. The net debt is actually the second best in the world. So Australians have $2.5 billion worth of debt in housing, and they have about 12, oh, sorry, I said billion, I should have said trillion. And they have 12. So they are fine. The problem you've got is that there might be a proportion of people that have bought their homes recently, haven't got ahead of the curve in terms of their repayment schedule, and have now laid off. But on average across Australia, and averages hide a lot of problems, the average consumer on a variable home loan is 3 years ahead of where they need to be. So systemically, it's not that important, but normally you have a cash flow issue. And the cash flow issue sort of hurts you when you get unemployment rates above 8, and we're going to be there. So the banks are going to have to be really, really careful about not foreclosing on someone who's got a short-term problem. And the last I heard, I'm not sure if they've announced it or not, because we sort of can't collude with the other big four, but I don't think any bank's going to be foreclosing on a mortgage anytime in the next 6 months. That's sort of going to give us a bit of over the top. But if you're still unemployed in 12 months' time, that's why we think house prices will probably be down 15% or so. We would expect that fundamentally they might stop falling by the middle of next year. But a lot of it's about sentiment. And if unemployment's still 7 and people are, and people are worried about their job, I mean, even if unemployment's 12%, 88% of the population still have a job. It's just that the 88% is scared.
So that leads to a question that's just come through is, if I think you refer to the banking sector at the moment as the shock absorber. What does that really mean for, I guess, there's a lot of retired people, and we know when you talk about franking credits and dividends in Australia, you're in a whole territory, and that affects giving as well, obviously, with a lot of our people giving. So how do you see that coming through the system?
Well, the shock absorber really is on the availability of credit to keep the economy going. If you're a retiree, that's a problem because the interest rates are very low and they're not going up. And even if you invest out the curve, you take 4 or 5 years, that's not much better because, the government, the RBA is trying to get 3-year rates at the same level as what the cash rate is, which drives everything down. So living on a pension is a bit of an issue, and that's why, to some extent, I think people have sold out of shares to try and give themselves some cash. It's also causing some problems for super funds. If you've got all your money as a super fund in infrastructure, and then the government says you can take 10 grand a year out, then those super funds probably have got enough to cover themselves, but not all of them will. That causes problems on the equity market because the way the super fund is going to get the money in the short term is going to sell liquid assets, and the most liquid asset they can sell is the equity market. So I think the shock absorber is more on the provision of credit and allowing businesses to go through rather than people to live on the interest that's sort of available.
Daniel, can I ask you to jump in? Because we've got a lot of organisations on the call who are relying on income, whether they're deposits over there, whether the investment returns at JB Weir, those glory days of CPI plus 3.5%, 4% returns with balanced portfolios. Like, what are you seeing there, Daniel? Like, what does the future look like for us and our clients?
Well, I don't, I guess, sort of cover off on the investment side so much. But I mean, as Alan's indicated, the longer term interest rate view is obviously very, very low for a long period of time. I think over the next 3 years, they expect BBSY, which is the base rate for variable rates, to sort of hover around 35 basis points or so. I mean, it's currently at 17, so it's actually below the official target cash rate at the moment. That's due to a lot of the cash that's flowing around the system at the moment. So I think when you've got such a low base rate, I mean, people, again, I don't cover the sector in terms of the investment side of things. It's obviously better for customers that are looking to hedge long term. And as Alan said, I mean, we're looking at low interest rates for, we're talking 2024. I guess you can essentially lock interest rates, a bit over 1% at the moment as a base rate for out to 10 years. So, I mean, it's taking a very long-term view on that. So it's good on the debt side, but obviously on the investment side, it's very challenging.
Yeah, and it's something we have to look at with many of our clients. We're looking at, well, what is the purpose of that capital, and what can when you have schools and healthcare, their inflation rates will still be running generally ahead of those rates. So, Alan, I think we have time for one more question, and I'll probably being an economics student myself, there's a question here that allows us to lift it up a level. There's what we think might happen, but what does, someone's asked a question around, well, what do we need to get used as a society to different standards of living? And in terms of what do you think, what would you like the government to take this opportunity to do in terms of tax reform or things, imbalances in the economy that really need to be addressed?
Well, I think that they should not waste a crisis, in the sense that they should look at how can you run this economy better. The governor of the central bank was talking about tax reform and personal tax reform. Corporate tax is also important. I think personal tax is more important in terms of the current environment, to get after tax income into people's housing or balance sheets. To me, the corporate tax is it gets rid of a disincentive, but people still, I don't want to be too negative on Australia. I think Australia has a really good lifestyle. I'm very pleased I'm living in Australia, not in Europe at present. So for a while, I was living in France for 4 years at the OECD. Really pleased I'm in Australia. And I think a lot of people, ultimately, when we get over this and we open up international, there'll be a big demand for people wanting to come to Australia. So I just want to try, if I was the government, I would like to keep this process as short as possible in terms of the virus, open things back up in a considered way, and then try and give people confidence, get their jobs, get back, and also give them some money to allow them to feel that it's better. Now, it's better to do it through the tax system than trying to engineer it through the wage system, because it just won't work. But the tax system might. So I would be very much into trying to lower the tax rate to improve the personal sector, and also to take away some of the disincentives of high corporate tax rates relative to the rest of the world. Because normally the argument is that if you've got a higher corporate tax rate, it's beneficial if you lower it, because therefore people will come more to your country. But if everybody's already lowered and we haven't, then it's actually a negative. So it's getting rid of a negative. Whereas if you can get it into the personal side, that's where the economy is going to pick up. So that's the sort of where I would be trying to do it. I'd like to see some more freeing up of the industrial relations system, but I think politics being politics, even in a pandemic, politics would get involved there. So I'll do things that I think they can get up and get done.
We can live in hope. Christian Porter and Sally Manus were best friends for a couple of weeks there. So, who knows? Who knows?
Shamal, I'll just jump in very quickly. I've been advised that we have time for one more question before we close.
Fantastic. And there was one question that was really interesting here, which was, I think, around the mining sector seems to be traveling pretty well with the iron ore prices holding up. So in terms of performance, how can we sort of, and that's connected to a China question as well, that's above it, obviously, in the demand side. So how do you sort of see that washing through? Or do you feel like there will be these shining lights in the economy?
Actually, what we're seeing in all our data is that the mining sector is actually not performing that well. The iron price is fine. It's 80 something, but the oil price
is way down. And what people forget is the oil price has a direct impact on the LNG price. And that's one of our big exports. We're the largest LNG exporter in the world now. So yes, China's important, and we're not really completely convinced as to we understand why mining is falling over. But it may be that they've closed the borders and people have trouble flying in, flying out, that sort of stuff. We just don't know. But what we can say is mining is one of the worst performing sectors at present. One of the better performing sectors, is, as I mentioned before, was agriculture. People start to eat, and you know, and so and it's raining. They're coming back, and so we, in one of these sort of seminars, we talked to the government, and one of the questions was, "How's agriculture?" And the answer was, "It's doing a lot better than most other sectors in the economy, and probably will, because they have decent crops and people still need to eat."
Just further on that, anecdotally, as I said at the start, I cover off a big part of our sort of corporate agri book across New South Wales, and anecdotally, we're seeing customers do very well in that space and thinking very long term. So there is some very promising signs amongst some of the obviously some of the more challenged sectors at the moment.
Well, and we're getting close to the end there, so we didn't design ending on a very positive note, but it looks like we have. So I'd just like to make a couple of observations. I guess this has been, as we've done work with our clients and ourselves, it's been such a unique, and I think what's interesting compared to some of the other recessions is it's such a collective experience for us all. It's not affected those people over there, it's affected every single person. And what I think the social distancing and the isolation to some extent has done is sort of made us think about those daily things we take for granted in all of our lives, but also remind us that we're very social animals, and that it's a defining factor, I guess, about why our species has been so successful. So when you think of the economic and the social impact, the thing we've seen a lot, and really it's created a lot of pressure, mental and emotional pressure and strain through a lot of systems, especially dealing with the crisis and a lot of change. One thing I've been really impressed by, oddly, and you know, I'm not the bank's biggest cheerleader by any stretch of the imagination, but the way they've dealt with this transition and the way they've looked after the people as the key asset of the organisation has been actually really exceptional. And I'm pleased to sort of note today that NAB is actually offering this sort of free support framework through its partner Benestar Group to all the clients. So to everyone on the call, all you have to do is call a number. It's 1300 360 364, and just say you're calling for the NAB Village Wellbeing Support Program. And so the program we all have access to, you all have access to as clients for free, up to 3 hours of I guess, support either telephone or Skype at no cost at all. So I'm glad that the business is using its asset to help our clients and our customers in the challenge they need, because I know in our sector especially, you don't have the money and the support for your people, and the people are the, you know, we work with board directors every day, I guess, and what they're concerned about is the same people who've just gone through the crisis have to now transform this organisation, and the pressure in organisations that are all already actually resource bound is significant. So that's, again, 1300 360 364 if you're interested in using that up. So in closing, what I'd like to say is thank you to Alan and Daniel for your time today and a very interesting conversation. I'd like to, you know, on behalf of JB and NAB, I hope this has been informative, and there will be a survey. So please do let us know what of it you find valuable and what of it you know, how you'd like us to communicate, whether in this format or written format in other ways. We'll make sure we're adding value, but simply if you want to know how we can specifically help you or your organisation, call your NAB banker or your JB or advisor, and we'll work with you not only on how we're working through this crisis, but quite as importantly, how do we reposition as the new normal emerges? How do we become successful together? As I said, as Alan said, we're not going, you know, we need to be really conscious of helping our clients be there on the other side, because stronger clients means a stronger bank and a stronger JB Weir. So Thank you all for making the time to join us today, and I wish you all good fortune and good health. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.